Good evening. I'm Susan Bailey, Executive Director of 108 Contemporary, a nonprofit arts organization dedicated to contemporary craft. Welcome to tonight's program, a talk with Alaina Roberts, author of I've Been Here All the While, Black Freedom on Native Land. Tonight's program is offered in conjunction with the exhibition My Soul Looks Back in Wonder, How I Got Over, featuring the work of Skip Hill and Letitia Huckabee. The exhibition continues at the gallery through June 20th. I am Zooming to you tonight from the gallery and the exhibition with the work of Letitia Huckabee behind me. Please take a moment to say hello and tell us where you're Zooming from using the chat feature located at the bottom of your screen. There will be time for a Q&A following tonight's presentation, so please leave your questions there so they can be answered at that time. Before I introduce tonight's speaker, I would like to acknowledge the sponsors who made this exhibition and its related programming possible. My Soul Looks Back is sponsored by Vision Tulsa, a grant program supported by the City of Tulsa and the Tulsa Arts Commission. Additional funding was provided by Robin Ballinger. I would also like to thank our community partner for this event, Magic City Books, an independent bookstore owned by the nonprofit Tulsa Literary Coalition. Alaina Roberts' book is available for purchase at Magic City Books, either in store or online. We're thankful to our neighbors in the Tulsa Arts District for partnering on this event with us tonight. Alaina Roberts is a historian who studies the intersection of Black and Native American life from the Civil War to the modern day. Her great-great-grandmother was among the thousands of Black people held as slaves by the Chickasaw tribe who received land allotments. Her family has lived in the state for generations. She is currently an assistant professor of history at the University of Pittsburgh. Dr. Roberts holds a PhD in history from Indiana University and a Bachelor of Arts in History with honors from the University of California, Santa Barbara. She writes, teaches, and presents public talks about Black and Native history in the West, family history, slavery in the 5 tribes, Native American enrollment politics, Black and Native American portrayals in the media, and identity. Her first book, I've Been Here All the While, Black Freedom on Native Land, is now available for purchase at Magic City Books. And now it is my pleasure to welcome to the podium, the virtual podium, Alaina Roberts.
Hello. Thanks so much, Susan, for inviting me here virtually. I have always wished that I was talented in the visual arts, but alas, I am not. So it's a real pleasure to be here to talk about my book and my family's connection to Oklahoma in honor of Skip Hill and Letitia Huckabee's work. So I want to first note that I do virtual presentations a little differently than some people. So I'm going to show you some PowerPoint slides throughout my presentation, but I'm always going to bring you back to my face. And that's because I think it's a little easier to focus when you're looking at the person talking rather than just an image. So I'm hoping that will help us along the way this evening. So like most people who identify as African American, I come from people who were enslaved for generations. But as Susan said, on my father's side, my ancestors were not owned by white people. They were owned by Native Americans. And so in the 1830s, they, along with their Chickasaw and Choctaw Indian owners, embarked on a journey that we know today as the Trail of Tears. And so they made their way to Oklahoma, which was then known as Indian Territory. Now, during the Civil War, their owners fought for the Confederacy, and when the Confederacy lost, the United States government forced my family's owners, along with other Native American slave owners, to free their slaves and provide them with land. And so in about a minute, I have reframed how most people think about slavery, Indian removal, the Civil War, and Reconstruction. And so this retelling of all these different histories is the core of my new book, I've Been Here All the While. And so this evening, I'm going to give you an overview of how my book allows us to see how Black and Native American history is intertwined. And that if we learn this history, we better understand how race and identity have functioned in this country. So I want to show you an image. These are two of my relatives on the, well, let's see, I guess you're right. The woman in the darker shirt, let's say, is my great grandmother, Lydia Jackson, and the woman on the left is her daughter, Josie Jackson. So these are two of the women that you will find in my book. Who I talk about is really kind of the core of the way I began to think about the Roberts family and their connection to land. And so Josie and Lydia were owned by a Chickasaw Indian named Tom Grant. The Chickasaws, as well as members of other 5 Indian nations, began buying and selling Black people as slaves around the mid to late 1700s. And so there are 5 slave-owning Indian nations, and they are the Chickasaws and Choctaws, who I've just mentioned, the Cherokees, probably the most well-known Indian nation, the Seminoles, and the Creeks. And really all of these 5 tribes have been in the news lately because of their COVID-19 vaccination efforts. But they're 5, I think, of the most well-known tribes, 5 of the biggest tribes in Oklahoma, certainly. And so together, these southeastern Indian nations were known as the 5 tribes. And so during the 1700s, white American politicians and reformers encouraged Native Americans, particularly these 5 groups, to adopt different aspects of Euro-American culture. And this included language, culture, clothing, political structures, and they argued that this would civilize them. So for example, Henry Knox, the Secretary of War under President George Washington, advocated what he called the civilization policy, because he believed that if Indians were more like whites, they would be more willing to give up a majority of their land. Then, in his ideal vision, Indians would use their reduced land holdings like whites. They would engage in agriculture and private land use and disavow their previous tradition of communal land ownership. Now, as chattel slavery became increasingly integral to white society, white Americans also encouraged Native people to become slaveholders because, of course, slaveholders were important parts of their society. Now, during this colonial era, Europeans learned things about Native American culture and adopted some of those aspects, while Native Americans did the same. And so both cultures are changing some of their ideas about gender, religion, and clothing. But the members of the 5 tribes that I've just showed you went a little further than most other Indian nations. And so a number of them learned English, educated themselves in American institutions, created their own newspapers, and remodeled their governments to look like that of the United States, with 3 different branches that we have. But also, the most wealthy and influential members of these tribes also decided to begin owning Black slaves. And of course, along with Black slave holding comes the idea that people of African descent are different and inferior. And so Native people are adapting to survive. They're changing because they've always been dynamic peoples. But adopting slavery is a little different than just creating your own newspaper or changing the way you dress. By adopting slavery, these tribes were also changing the way that they thought about race. And so when we think about how Native Americans first encountered Europeans and Africans, they looked at them as both equally foreign, both equally different from themselves. But as the United States built itself up as a country where slavery was very important to its economic and social foundations, Native people saw that Africans and African Americans were treated very differently from Europeans. They saw that they were looked at as less human. And by adopting slavery, these 5 Indian nations signaled that they were ready to accept this idea of Black people, this sort of racial hierarchy that hadn't existed in their societies before. And so they began to change their laws to include slavery. And soon they had pretty much all of the sorts of laws that we associate with the US South. So slave owners could punish their slaves harshly. Enslaved people were not allowed to read or write. They could not meet for religious gatherings unless given permission, and so on. But in the late 1820s and early 1830s, the lives of these slave-owning tribes changed. So since contact, the British had really struggled to reconcile the fact that they wanted Native American land with the reality that they didn't have the manpower or the resources to take it by force. And so in the early kind of contact period, Europeans made agreements with Native people for land parcels or for control of various regions. And while the colonial period saw Native peoples and Europeans negotiating on pretty much equal grounds, sometimes with Native people actually having more power and influence, as time goes on, this changes. So after the Revolutionary War, coercive white encroachment on Native American lands steadily increases as white settlers go more and more farther out from the original colonies, and they're seeking resources and they're seeking homelands. Now, plantation style slavery is also spreading at the same time through the 19th century. The five tribes are finding their lush, agriculturally rich southeastern homes under attack. White settlers begin squatting on their lands illegally, and state governments actually follow the lead of individual Americans by sanctioning this trespassing and trying to extend their laws over Native American tribes. And this is all really part of an effort to try to force Native Americans farther west, as they have been trying to do since really the beginning of the country. Now, Native Americans, of course, fight against this legally, also sometimes physically. But unfortunately, because President Andrew Jackson eventually backs this, of course, he signs the 1830 Indian Removal Act. Eventually, Native people do have to move for the most part. And so on this kind of trail that most of us have been taught, the Trail of Tears, all of the five tribes, the members who own slaves, bring those enslaved people. And so on this kind of really important foundational journey to many Native people, Black people are also experiencing this hardship. And in addition, they are taking care of their owners. They're chopping wood for fires. They're hauling items that they're bringing on this trip. They're helping children. They're helping older people walk along this trail. And so what I really want you to take from this part of my presentation, at least, is that the Trail of Tears is also a part of Black history for these enslaved people in these tribes. Now, if you learned about Indian removal, then you know that it was horrific. Some Cherokees were actually kept in pens until they were forced to leave. And there are kind of all of these horrific events that we may have learned, because I think Indian removal is often the only thing that we learn about Native American history. But the kind of interesting part about Indian removal that I talk about in my book that I was not taught about is that there were actually people already in Indian territory. There were already Native people who called this region home, who farmed there, who hunted there, and who occasionally lived there. These are people such as the Comanches, the Plains Apaches, the Wichitas, the Uchis, and other Western peoples. And so the five tribes, as well as other Native people later, are displaced from the Southeast and brought to or forced to come to Indian territory. But then there are already people in Indian territory who are also displaced to make room for these people. And so it's kind of a domino effect that this migration brings. But what I really want to talk about is how the five tribes deal with this. How do they deal with these Native people that they come into contact with? So once they're in Indian territory, they, along with the enslaved people in their nations, begin to rebuild. So they build homes, government buildings, churches, and schools. But in response to the people whose home this already was, they call them savages. And they actually ask the United States to build a fort to protect them because they're afraid of them. They are raided by these Western peoples. The Western peoples sometimes steal resources, cattle, food, enslaved people. And so this is an antagonistic relationship created by this displacement and migration. But I want to show you the specific way that some of the leaders in the five tribes talk about these Western people. And so there is a Choctaw leader. At the time, he was a young man named Peter Pitchlynn. And this is the way he describes some of these Western people. He says, "You never saw such a people in your life. Their manners and action are wild in the extreme. They are in a perfect state of nature and would be a curiosity to any civilized man." Now, that wouldn't be surprising at all if I told you that a white man said that. But to hear that actually a Native American man said this about another Native American group of people, it's a little surprising, right? It's a little confusing, perhaps. And so when I talk about how slavery changed the way the five tribes thought about Black people, this is also part of a change in the way the five tribes thought about other Indians who had not adopted American customs. So not only did the five tribes, or some members of the five tribes, start to think that they were better than Black people, but they also thought that they were better than most other Native people. So by the 1850s, the five tribes are thriving in their new homeland. For example, the Chickasaw Nation has created a school system that educated a good number of both their boys and girls, and actually white people from neighboring states and territories sent their children to go to these schools because they were considered so good. But of course, in the United States, discord over the institution of slavery is brewing. Abolitionists are gaining a hold on popular culture, and various states are voting on allowing it or not within their borders. And so as Southern states secede, the Confederacy approaches the five tribes, and reaching out to them really speaks to this shared desire to maintain slavery and also to keep federal jurisdiction out of their borders. Now, in some nations, like the Cherokee and Creek nations, there were very large factional disputes over the institution of slavery that really go back decades. But some of the five tribes, such as the Chickasaws and Choctaws, are actually quite interested in what the Confederacy is offering them. And so the Confederacy, the various representatives who reach out to the five tribes are actually quite familiar with some of these Indian leaders. And so they know exactly really what the five tribes dislike about the United States and about that relationship. And so the Confederacy tells them, we're going to treat you better than the United States. We're going to give you congressional representation. We're going to allow you a say in governmental affairs. We're going to allow you to keep your Indian land and Indian territory forever without white settlement. We're going to be more reliable at paying you for your southeastern homelands, which is a really big issue. Now, would the Confederacy have actually kept these promises? Probably not. Of course, the Confederacy is made up of tribes or made up of states who have really just pushed out the five tribes about 30 years before. And so these are not necessarily white Americans who truly respect Native people or tribal sovereignty, but these entreaties are enticing to some members of the five tribes, especially the Chickasaws. Now, there is another reason that the five tribes would have an interest in possibly joining with the Confederacy, and that is their geographic location. And so they are near Arkansas and Texas, two very Confederate regions. And so the kind of risk to them if they don't have this alliance is that they will still be overrun with Confederate soldiers and risk a lot of danger, a lot of murder, a lot of theft. And so it actually is better that they would have some kind of relationship with the Confederacy. And so we have this practical kind of reason about geography, but then we also have this shared ideology around slavery for many of the leaders of these nations. Now, the Union Army does not send any kind of reinforcements to Indian Territory. In fact, it refuses to even give them leftover guns. And so they really do leave the five tribes unprotected. And so going into the Civil War, all the five tribes are split, meaning members of each tribe fight for both sides. They all have kind of reasons for either fighting for the Union, fighting for the Confederacy, or actually leaving Indian Territory. And so a few thousand of people from these tribes become, in essence, refugees, leaving and going into other nations or going into the United States because they really try to avoid this war as much as they can. Just like in the United States, there are enslaved Black men from the five tribes who fight for the Union or who are forced to help the Confederacy by performing labor. Now, when the war is over, the United States ignores the fact that, as I've said, they did not help the five tribes with protection, and also that they really kind of didn't provide any sort of reassurance about the five tribes and their connection to them. Instead, the United States uses the fact that some tribal members fought for the Confederacy against the five tribes. And so they point to this alliance and they say, you know, we can't trust you, and we're not going to honor any of your previous treaties unless you make a new treaty with us. And so the US withheld things from them like the annuities from the payment of the sale of their southeastern homelands and says, you know, you need to do this treaty with us or we're not going to give you this money. And so this money is something that is already actually owed them, of course, because they've already sold their homelands as they were forced to, and they really need this money. After the Civil War, they are decimated. They really need help. And so they're really coerced into signing these treaties. And so these post-war treaties are called the Treaties of 1866. And they really serve as both the five tribes' official kind of surrender documents, as well as their reconstruction documents. And I'll explain what I mean by that. One of the most extreme items in these treaties is the cession of land. And so the five tribes, of course, have just moved onto this land around 30 years earlier, and they were already being forced to give up almost 3/4 of it, a very significant amount of it, for American settlement. And this was not what was promised to them. The other three big items in these treaties relevant to our discussion today were that the five tribes had to emancipate the enslaved people in their nations, they had to adopt them as citizens, and they had to give them land. And the Chickasaw and Choctaw nations had to give them specifically 40 acres of land. Now, if you're at all familiar with Reconstruction or really with Black history in general, then you know how significant that 40 acres is because African Americans in the United States fought for that and didn't get it. And so this post-war period and these events I'm talking about, this is the United States coming into other nations, Indian nations, that are supposed to have the right to create their own laws, run their own nation, be completely sovereign in just about every way. And the US is saying, we are going to force you to free enslaved people, something we ourselves could not do without a war. We are forcing you to adopt them as citizens and give them all the rights of citizens, something we ourselves in 1866 have not yet done. Was this right legally? No. Now, the Cherokee Nation had ordered emancipation in 1863. So they were the only one of the 5 tribes to actually do this without direct coercion. But all of the others, the Creeks, the Seminoles, the Chickasaws, the Choctaws, would they have ever emancipated enslaved people without American intervention? We don't know. And after emancipation, would they have given their former slaves rights and citizenship? Maybe. Would they have given them land? Probably not. But this freedom, these rights, and this land especially put the former slaves of the 5 tribes on a different plane than African Americans in the United States. It gave them different opportunities. And these opportunities are why so many Black people from the US flocked there after emancipation. And so for me, this is one of those historical moments where my identity as both a historian and a descendant of former slaves of Chickasaws and Choctaws comes into play because I have to realize something as legally wrong as US intervention in a foreign nation, or as Indian nations were known, domestic dependent nations. But I also have to recognize that people like my family may have never been freed if not for these legally unjust actions on the part of the United States. Now, once they are freed, I give these former slaves a specific term. And so I want to show you that just so it's clear. And so for all of the 5 tribes, I call them Indian freed people. The legal term is Indian freedmen or freedmen. And of course, for specific tribes, I call them Chickasaw freed people or Cherokee freed people and freedwoman and freedman. I'm going to use those terms in the rest of the talk. And so what I am talking about, this land in these treaties, is Black land receipt through American governmental action. And so if you know anything about this history, congressional Republicans had not been able to agree on giving African Americans in the United States land. It was pretty impossible for the majority of Republicans, who were moderates, to imagine taking land from a white person and giving it to a Black person. As I am sure you know, property ownership was and continues to be one of the most revered American values. But Republicans such as the Secretary of the Interior and the Commissioner of Indian Affairs at the time could imagine giving Indian land to people of African descent because they deemed them less civilized than white Americans. And so to them, giving Indian land away to people of African descent fulfilled this kind of lofty idealistic Republican goal of Black land ownership while still allowing whites to maintain their land in the United States. And so this is part of my new take on Reconstruction, that when we look at how the United States passed the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, but ultimately failed Black people by not giving them land or a way to really lift themselves out of poverty and racism that slavery created, we can actually look to Indian Territory for a different sort of Reconstruction project. And there was a Reconstruction where Black slaves were emancipated and became citizens, but also received land. Land that sometimes had oil and natural gas on it, which helped create wealth, and land that served as foundation for homesteads and communities. And so for my family specifically, after they were emancipated, they settled in what is now Ardmore, Oklahoma. And so I know some of you here are probably Oklahomans, but for you non-Oklahomans, let me show you Ardmore. So this is just kind of a general, generic image of where Ardmore is between 2 of the kind of most well-known places in Oklahoma. We have Oklahoma City here, and then we have Dallas and Fort Worth down here. So Ardmore is really in southern Oklahoma, essentially. And then this is actually a historical photo of Ardmore, the main street. I thought this was really cool when I found this. And so here in Ardmore, my great grandfather Jack and his family raised chickens and cows and planted trees. Jack was actually the first in the region to buy a Wisconsin JI Case Company case threshing machine. And for all you people who are not farmers, let me just kind of give you an image of that. This is a case threshing machine. And this is, it's not cheap. And so it was actually kind of significant that Jack Roberts was able to purchase this for his farming. So Jack Roberts and his family built and ran a general store where freed people from around the Chickasaw Nation came to buy goods on credit and pay for them when the crop came in, as well as to actually discuss politics. My family also built and helped to fund a school called Dawes Academy, which was the first school for Black children in the Chickasaw Nation. Education for Black people in Indian Territory, just like for Black people in the United States, was really one of the dearest goals for their children. And they recognized its potential to uplift people of African descent into this new world of slavery, or new world of freedom from slavery. And so Dawes Academy had 2 stories with classrooms, a dining room, a kitchen, and dormitories for teachers, girls, and boys. So I wanted to show you a few items from Dawes Academy. So here's a teacher's quarterly report. So you can see up here, it says Dawes Academy, a day school in the Chickasaw Nation. If you look closely, you can see some Robertses. We have Alaina Roberts right here. We have Eva Roberts. And then there are other families, such as the Coheys, the Wilsons, who were part of the community that my family created, which was really full of predominantly Chickasaw freed people, and then also people who had been owned by Choctaws. This is the annual report from the Mission Society that helped to fund and run Dawes Academy. And so we see here some of the women, predominantly women, who helped to run the school. This one, Mary A. Dawes, was the first kind of principal / teacher at the Dawes Academy. Oh, and then this is part of an article actually written about the Dawes Academy. As you can see at the first paragraph, talks about this history of Indian Territory, and then it goes into a little about the academy itself and the Roberts family is mentioned in this article. And so in this article, the oldest living student was George Roberts, who recalled his father, Jack, who I mentioned, my great-great-grandfather, paying $1 per month for his tuition. So if you do a conversion, that's approximately $27 per month today. And so this was feasible, but not an insignificant amount for Jack. And so to me, that demonstrates that he did place an importance on the education of his son. Now, Dawes Academy had a multiracial student body, and so there were Black children, of course. White children were not allowed to go to these schools, but Indian children were if they wanted to. And so Dawes Academy had a number of Native American students as well. And so my family and others in these Indian nations were able to use the land that they received as the location of schools and churches, and also to use resources obtained from their land to purchase other things. And this land that people like my family received had the possibility of changing their lives. There is an economist named Melinda Miller who found that Cherokee freed people, the focus of one of her studies, were 5 times more likely than Blacks in the South to own a farm in 1880. And this is a measure not just of their income ability, but also their ability to accumulate general wealth and to obtain upward mobility. They were more likely to attend school, attend for a greater number of months, and also have a higher literacy rate. And so these are very big things. Now, seeing Black people in Indian Territory living on their own land and building schools and churches brought thousands of Black and white settlers to the region. Because of Indian free people's land ownership and relatively positive lives within Indian nations, African Americans who were predominantly unable to purchase their own land in the US and were disappointed with the Republicans' failure, began to see Indian Territory as a possible paradise, a place where they could latch on to this land that Indian free people got or claim their own land, and a place where they could be free from white violence. And so Black information networks began spreading news about Indian Territory, and Black newspapers began trumpeting this news of Black land ownership in this region and encouraging African Americans to make their way there. Some African Americans actually even floated the idea of an all Black state in Indian Territory. In 1880, J.H. Williamson, a former slave, the longest serving Black 19th century state congressman of North Carolina, and the founder of a newspaper called The Banner, testified in front of the Senate. He said that African Americans were leaving the South in droves because of racism, because of many of the Southern states were denying them rights. He suggested that the US government set up a place where Black people could be free from these issues, and he suggested Indian Territory as this place. In his words, the West was the opportunity to carve out their future destiny under the shining sun of heaven. Now, those are very hopeful words. Those are words that certainly paint the picture of someone who thinks that Indian Territory is a place where Black people have opportunities that are not available to them elsewhere, especially in the South. Now, while this call for government-supported Black Western migration was not successful in creating an all-Black state, words like this did motivate thousands of African Americans to leave the South for Indian Territory. And so this is the result of Black migration. All of these all-Black towns. And so as you can see, there are many kind of that were at one point existent. Some of them have kind of lost most of their population. There is certainly a movement today that you may be aware of to really enliven these communities and bring people back in to live or just for tourism. But this is an amazing map. And so if you're not aware, Oklahoma is the state with the largest number of all Black towns. And all Black towns, of course, are towns founded by African Americans throughout the United States who are seeking opportunities and seeking to escape the violence and segregation of the South. Now, Oklahoma Black towns were often a combination of an Indian freed person's land and African Americans from the United States resources and promotion. And so one of the most famous Black towns, Boley, began as the land of 6-year-old Abigail Barnett, who was a Creek freed girl. And Boley would become the largest predominantly Black town in North America at the turn of the century. This is after a trio of investors began bringing people there through these information networks and through newspapers because there was going to be a railroad station built there. And this is how a lot of these small towns in the West in the 19th century and going into the 20th century are created because of the railroad. Now in Boley, Indian free people and African Americans mixed, and a woman named Lula Mixon remembered that people were coming in so fast that there was no place for them to sleep. So they lived in tents until they acquired the funds and resources to build homes. And that kind of gives you a sense of the urgency, the desire of people to live in these places. Now, with the successful construction of the railroad station came capital, resources, and increased migration to Boley. And soon residents could patronize over 55 businesses like T.B. Armstrong Hardware Store, Mrs. J.H. Bagby Drugstore, Boley Printing Company, a millinery shop, a grocery and dry goods store, and on and on. The town had a newspaper, the Boley Progress, and several churches. And so Boley in particular becomes a symbol of Black progress, particularly for its excellence in educating its townspeople and school children. And they eventually built 2 private high schools and 1 public school. Now, aside from these all Black towns, before and after Oklahoma became a state in 1907, African Americans also shaped majority white cities like Tulsa. And so I want to end this on this note of Tulsa, particularly the part of Tulsa known as the Greenwood District or Black Wall Street. So I grew up in California, but because my father's family is from Oklahoma and we travel there numerous times for family reunions, from the time that I was very small, I knew the history of Black Wall Street. I knew that there was a part of Tulsa that was settled by Black people and that became a haven for their economic success, with streets lined with rooming houses, a movie theater, grocery stores, lawyers' offices, an auto repair shop. I could go on. And these were all owned by and catering predominantly to Black people. I also knew that on May 31st, 1921, much of Black Wall Street was destroyed by a mob of angry white people who didn't like Black success and who really used the excuse of an alleged attack on a white woman to murder Black women and children and to destroy Black homes and businesses. And of course, you probably know this, but historians believe that possibly up to 300 people may have been killed. We don't know yet for sure. I just read that they are resuming the search for archaeological remains. And so hopefully soon we will see just how many people perished in that unfortunate day. The 100th anniversary is coming up very soon, but it's really only been recently that most people learned about this massacre, and that's because it's been systemically erased. So people didn't talk about it because they were scared to. Textbooks didn't talk about it. A lot of the Tulsa and really statewide Oklahoma residents and infrastructure didn't want to talk about it, and also smeared the name of Black people who were really defending themselves. And this is part of the terminology. And so when we think about how this for so long was called a riot, just like many other attacks on Black people in the United States, the word riot really is taking responsibility away from white Americans and making it kind of an equal attack. But actually, we have changed, journalists, historians, a lot of people have changed the term to massacre, because that's a way of really realizing and acknowledging that this was not, of course, justified. And this was really a concerted attack on Black townspeople by their fellow white citizens. It was Black people trying to protect themselves and their property from unsolicited white anger. And so while the massacre is, of course, an important piece of history within itself, I feel that we cannot truly understand it without understanding what came before it. We cannot understand why so many Black people flocked to Indian Territory and later to the state of Oklahoma without understanding that they came because there were Black people here with their own land, and that these Black people were given this land and freed really by the United States, and that they had come to Indian Territory in the 1820s and 1830s with their native owners because they were pushed out by white Americans who wanted their land to build plantations. And so in this way, understanding the Black Native history that I've talked to you about this evening is central to understanding some of the major events in our history, like Indian removal, like Reconstruction, and also to understanding our country's history of race relations and racial violence. And so I hope that you will now have a desire to buy my book to learn more. And now I will take any questions that you have. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Alaina, for your presentation tonight. Part of the reason we were so interested in having you give this talk is that I think it's just a wonderful way to think about this intersection of Black and Native history in our state that is often not really considered. So we really want to thank you for bringing it to our attention, and especially in light of this exhibition that, especially with Letitia's work, really deals with a lot of issues of migration and displacement. And so your talk was just a wonderful complement to the work that's on display. So thank you. So thank you again to Alaina, and thanks to all of you for taking the time to join us tonight for this fascinating authors talk. Be safe out there, everyone. Good night.
Thank you.